If you want to teach a young person
or an old person,
or an older person, your fundamental duty is to not give them answers, but to teach them. And the journey of education and learning comes with it that beautiful wrestling where the person wrestles with the problem, the thing they don't know.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. And this week, very pleased to have Dr. Ian Hunter from Writer's Toolbox joining us on the show. How are you, Ian?
Oh, Paul, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, real privilege to have you joining the show. Before we we jump in to the full episode, big thank you to our show partners, to 1NZ, Spark, 2 Degrees, HP, Workday, and Gorilla Technology. Really appreciate their support of the New Zealand Tech Podcast, and I guess of the broader tech and innovation ecosystems that they support around New Zealand. Well, today I'm excited to chat to you. We were talking before the show, and already lots of fascinating stories and discussion.
I've forgotten most of them by now.
Around innovation, your background, the things that you research for your PhD, and obviously the work that you've been doing with Writer's Toolbox in terms of delving in and helping from an education perspective and using AI maybe in a perspective that folks might not be expecting. So, yes, maybe we can start with a little bit of your background.
Oh, gollies. It's interesting you think about what you might want to do in life, and some people have a very clear view. I'm sure you always wanted to be a digital podcast host, but I never thought I'd be here. For 20 years of my life, I was a very happy university professor. It's a great life. The holidays are long. The students don't answer back much. The library's very large. It's wonderful. But I suppose, about the mid-90s, I started to get quite concerned about what today we call the global writing gap. And this is students often who can tell you the answer, but then that same person goes to put it on a piece of paper and it just is much poorer quality. And you realise the problem they're facing, it's not an engagement problem or a motivation problem, it's fundamentally a writing problem. So I wrote some books to help, used to run lectures at the university, and eventually schools started calling me up. They said, Ian, our senior students are using your material. Could you come and speak? And I said, no, go away. Put the phone down. Because I was very happy at university. It's a great life. But look, eventually I caved. And I think one year I spoke to 29,000 students across 60 schools.
Wow.
And I realised, the same things that my university students were saying. How do you start? How do you analyse something? These school students were facing the same thing. We haven't taught 3 generations of teachers how to teach writing. So, I left the university. We started an organisation to help. And long story short, today we have about 50, 60 staff working with around 700 schools around the world. And here you and I are.
Yeah, look, this is fascinating. So when you first started Writer's Toolbox, was technology kind of a key part of it? How have you kind of shaped what you do today?
I think the problem hasn't altered because it's fundamentally an education problem, and you and I probably had some great moments in our schooling career or post-school career where just an inspired, profound teacher just got us, right? And you didn't need tech to pull that off. But the writing problem, if we got time, we could get into it. It's not just the question of the tech. It's how best also might you teach writing to that student who's struggling. And so Toolbox has been, if you like, solving 2 problems. How might we use technology effectively to deliver this, but also how might we teach writing? And in many of the sort of fields I've had the privilege to research or be part of in my career, I've gone backwards first to look for answers for the future. And I've done that in the area of entrepreneurship and innovation as well. And so when I came to the writing problem, I wanted to know what had worked historically. And I went back across 150 years of writing research. And there have been 4 great phases in the teaching of writing globally. The first was from about 1860 to the First World War. And this was an era where countries around the world, Australia, New Zealand, America, the United Kingdom, were grasping with this problem of nationalised education. If we're going to have national education, how can we, what do we teach? When do we teach it? All those sorts of questions. And writing was taught by principles, matters of form, structure, style, the rules of composition. You get to the First World War, and from the First World War to about 1960, they're now called the traditional age because they said, enough of the principles, let's have good old-fashioned grammar and the 5-paragraph essay. And it's where it came from, this form of writing. And about the 1960s, the world had been through another global conflict and rock and roll was coming in. Many people were questioning, the structures of society. Educators were similar. And they said, you know what? We've taken all the joy out of writing. And they brought in process writing, Donald Murray and Donald Graves in America. Now creativity was elevated. And the child, irrespective of the errors or not, was just enjoying the thrill of writing. But by the 1980s, educators went, it's not very good, is it? And we brought in
It takes a while, doesn't it?
It takes a while.
These things, yeah?
And we brought in genre. And now teachers would teach narrative and recount writing and information reports. And underneath were the skills of writing. But for the first time in history, we inverted a pyramid. Because historically, the craft of writing was at the top and the forms underneath. And genre had inverted that. So when I came to Toolbox and this problem of how are we going to teach someone to write, I said, I really like what they did in the age of composition. I think they've got it. So if you said, what is Toolbox? I'm going to say, Toolbox, we have brought back the old-fashioned rules of composition for a 21st century audience.
That's great. Now, there's obviously an AI piece that sort of fits in here as well. I must say, I also like the fact that you kind of look back, because that's part of my futurist toolkit when I'm when I'm working with boards and leadership and talking to groups, is like, hey, we need to look back to inform
really
how we consider the future. So that's good. But now there's this piece where generative AI is coming into everything, right? Whether it's classrooms or you're walking down the street and you need to figure something out and so on. We're tending to lean into our generative AI from so many different perspectives, and we're still figuring that out. But do you see that that's going to create another sort of paradigm and an era just by default? Because there's this nature as technology comes in, it tends to wash over things, and sometimes it washes things away, and sometimes it helps make things better. And some of these things come about quite sort of unintentionally, right? Yep. It's just, this is part of the new era. And I've been chatting to some tutors recently who have been sharing some of their challenges with students using generative AI at times that they're not expecting them to. Yeah. And we're clearly it's maybe an inappropriate shortcut to get a result without necessarily the learning taking place in the middle. They're getting a result down on the screen or in what gets printed out or what have you, but there's not a complete understanding, unfortunately.
That's such a good question. And I should say, for the sake of the benefit of the listeners tuning in, I've been watching Paul for a while now. No AI was used in the creating of these questions whatsoever.
Often it is, though. We do sometimes use AI. Very helpful.
I think, that's such a good question. You've touched on a lot of points. Maybe I could pick up 2 threads. The first is this. We don't do generative AI at Toolbox. If you think about the development of AI, our journey into AI started in 2014. So we've been doing this now for about a decade. we have our own AI. We have a patent in AI. We began this journey before OpenAI actually was even founded as an organization. And when the rest of the world turned right with generative AI, we turned left with educational AI. Because one of the things that generative AI does brilliantly, and you've testified it to yourself, if you want a highly detailed, informative answer to a question, it may not always be right, but it'll sound authoritative. AI is very helpful. And there are other uses too, I'm not trivializing. That's fantastic. But if you want to teach a young person,
or an old person,
or an older person, your fundamental duty is to not give them answers, but to teach them. And the journey of education and learning comes with it that beautiful wrestling where the person wrestles with the problem, the thing they don't know. And when they discover the answer, part of the cementing of the new understanding, not just the knowledge, but the new understanding, is that wonderful, emotional burst, because you've discovered it. You know it for yourself, and the learning is sticky. And one of the things we know from research in this area is that, and I'm thinking about some studies that were done in 2024, we know if you get students using AI to write their essays, the essays will be of a higher quality. We know that. But we know in those same studies, when they have tested those same students, they don't know the actual knowledge underneath that. So what you have created now is a gap, and you have no understanding either. So at Toolbox, our challenge, how can you build an AI to teach somebody, not give them the answers? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good. So, well, let's delve into that a little bit further. So what does that actually look like? What is it that you end up providing to the schools who sign up with Writer's Toolbox?
Yeah.
What do they get for their money?
Well, Toolbox at one level, yes, it's an application that you buy, and it's a whole school writing application. This is not an advertisement, but I'm just trying to explain it. It's a whole school writing application. So the student can write
if
in.
If it works, everyone listening who's involved in a school or has a youngster at school should then be going, hey, why aren't we using this? And my impressions are pretty positive so far.
Writing touches everything. Today, traditionally, when you and I were at school, and this is no blight on our age, but if you weren't good at English, I'm going to ask Paul in a second what his English was like. If you weren't good at English, you picked PE because you could, or music, or somewhere, or art, somewhere you could excel, and your writing skills weren't into question. In fact, the person who was the best artist or the best, had the greatest physical prowess would get the highest grades. Today in New Zealand, if you pick stage 3, year 3 PE, you made the dumb choice. There is more writing today in PE than there is in senior English. So we now have in New Zealand one of the most literary curriculums in the world.
Interesting.
The senior student in New Zealand, by the time you have finished your year 13, you will have cast in the order of 55 to 60,000 words across all those subjects. And that's if you pick things like PE and biology and history and English and maybe another science. The average biology report is 3,000 words long. Statistics now, it's not about the maths, it's can you craft that maths in written form and show deep understanding. So Toolbox is about giving writing tools to all of those students and adults because they need them.
Yeah, and I guess, if I look forward, there's your school years, but once you get into the workforce, being able to communicate well and clearly is pretty essential, right? And that probably was for me when English sort of started to matter, because How
did you go at English? You didn't tell me, by the way. How did you go at English? Did you like it?
Well, there's a little bit of a story. So I have 2 older brothers, and turned out both of them. This is going back a few years. They're older than me, and the way that they did the exams back then is you'd get an exact percentage.
Yeah.
And anyway, this is not something to boast about, but anyway, both of them got 50% in English.
Yeah.
And I thought, I want to be like my big brothers, so I want to get 50% too. But they changed the way that they scored they scored these things when I was going through what was fifth form in those days, and I was in this bracket. What's it called? I think they had A1, A2, B1, B2, and then the C's. I was in the B2 bracket, which was 45 to 55, and so of course I was very curious. Well, did I get exactly the same as them? And you could actually call up or something and get the exact score, but for whatever reasons, they didn't want people to feel bad if their score was a little bit under 50 and so on. So they put them in these brackets. And
you got.
And it turned out I was at the lower end of that one. So kind of wish I hadn't have been interested and made the call. But for me, it was when I got into the workplace and communicating became really important. That I took an interest in how I wrote at that stage when I was being thrown Shakespeare or what have you. That actually didn't align with my interest as a teenager, where I was interested in technology, and business, and so on. So those were my areas, but I didn't see how the dots kind of joined up, right?
But you do now as an adult, right? Or even you think many of us have to retrain. We pivot mid-career, correct? And then your ability to learn, to absorb information, to articulate that clearly and deeply. But you raised a really interesting point, because I did want to ask you, sidebar, if somebody had taught you the rules of composition, how would that have gone for you?
Probably would have been quite helpful.
We've seen this especially in boys, the growth rates in boys, the impact of toolbox. We could talk about that later. But it's also the resilience to change career, and where this hinges is the connection between writing and thinking. If we just think, for an example, that you think in your brain a beautifully well-formed thought and then just write it out on paper, we miss the moment. We miss the moment because the research has shown very clearly over the past 50 years this beautiful connection between the thinking brain and the act of writing. And when we write, we don't just regurgitate on the page what we think. It's in the act of writing itself that we think. So in the act of writing, our thinking becomes amplified, deeper, more insightful, because as the words emerge on the page, the subconscious goes to work and fires up thoughts and insights that we previously could never have articulated, that came to the surface as we write.
That's fascinating. Do you think most people recognise that?
No, and I don't think they do.
Because it's not something we talk about very often, but it sounds really important.
We need to have this debate, because we have built our education systems on the first premise. We teach writing avidly through primary school, and then we stop. And we sort of tacitly assume that as you move through your high school years, you're merely just using writing as the form to regurgitate knowledge or prove it. But there's been some great researchers now across the past decade in America, Steve Graham and others, who said, no, hold on a second. As the student advances through their high school years, and we demand greater output, deeper cognitions, superior thought development, if you don't in parallel teach more sophisticated writing skills, you see a gap. And I think one of the great challenges but opportunities we have in this country is if we could close that, we would see all sorts of benefits. And I'm not trivializing this. We know already that the gap between somebody who's been post-school to university versus somebody who has not, or actually some sort of qualification, doesn't have to be university, polytechnic, versus somebody who hasn't, is about $1.5 million across their lifetime to 1.7. That's the difference between being a homeowner and a renter. That's a house.
This is really significant.
This is significant, right? So if we have the opportunity to actually give the gift of writing to a student in a form that the student can understand it and grasp it, we actually have the opportunity to transform their entire career trajectory and their contribution to our society.
Wow. do you find that schools get good adoption with Writer's Toolbox? Like, how does it actually, play out in terms of them bringing Writer's Toolbox into their, into the classroom?
Yeah, it's a good question.
And, how successful has that kind of been? Because you've said you've grown to now, 700 schools?
Yeah, that's right. We work in about 7 different curriculum systems. It's from International Baccalaureate to Cambridge to the New Zealand curriculum, Australian curriculum, and others actually, yeah.
Because not everyone clicks with every way of learning, right?
Correct. I think one of the things, so let's take them one at a time. One of the first things we touched on early on was the teachers haven't been taught how to teach writing. We have gifted educators in our schools, really well-trained professionals, but we haven't taught them how to teach composition, writing, for a number of generations. So our first job with the school actually is building teacher capability. A recent survey of something like 4,000 Australian teachers in New South Wales, 60% said they do not feel confident to teach writing in the classroom. So if the teachers don't have that sense of authentic confidence, the students are not going to get it. So we have a program of really good adult learning professional development that goes alongside Toolbox to teach the teachers how to teach writing, and then you deploy the Toolbox itself. And one of the things, I suppose, because you talked about impact and adoption, so we see several things. Australia has been really good for us in this journey because, not only from the point of view of growing an organisation, we wouldn't have survived COVID if it wasn't having an export market, but also in terms of proof of product, because Australia has a standardised writing test that every student, grades 3, 5, 7 and 9 in Australia, do every year. 1.4 million Australians sit this test. And whether you like testing or not, from our perspective, it's a litmus test. If we journeyed with a school and we taught these students a different approach, and the teachers, and we switched on the AI, when you turn all that off and that child's sitting in an examination hall with a pen and a piece of paper, can they do it? And will they get a different outcome? And Australia's given us the privilege now. We have a longitudinal study going on, which is very difficult to say without a glass of water. And that's been going on for about 6 years now. We're tracking about 78,000 students using Toolbox in 71 Australian schools. And already at the 4-year mark, if you teach a year 3 student this approach and you've switched on the AI so they get that personalised, unique, customised feedback in the moment of readiness, the difference between the traditional methods being taught and a school using this is 3 times the rate of growth. At year 5, the data was 5 times the rate of growth. At year 7, they leapfrog like schools, and the same thing happened at year 9. Then we identified the boys only, and the rate of growth in boys was 10 times the state of Queensland.
Wow.
So, and that study has now been replicated in New South Wales, and we have a pilot program also now going on in Britain with 20 schools, and they're already saying the same things.
And so is this something you were able to measure within your software, or are there other kind of, independent ways of measuring it? Because this sounds like the sort of thing that is going to make it pretty easy for you to sell Writer's Toolbox around the world.
The good thing is that it's external measures. It's either the school's own data. We have a diagnostic test in Writer's Toolbox, so this shows us many of these things. But, for any innovator, part of the definition of innovation, right? Innovation is only ever defined by the customer, not the creator. It's not me saying this is innovative. It's the customer saying this thing has actually profoundly changed and helped my world. And I have made a decision now, conscious decision, to change how I do, what I do, where I purchase because of what has been done. And look, it's humbling, but I think that's been part of the journey the team at Writer's Toolbox have pulled off. Yeah.
Now tell us a little bit about the the business and getting from, working in
Oh,
academia,
no.
working in the university. And I was chatting to a friend this morning who's been on a podcast or two with me, Dr. Paul Woodfield, and you guys have interacted in the education system. And he was saying, it's pretty impressive because the university world is a pretty comfortable one in which to operate in.
It was.
And to step out of that into the world of entrepreneurship and business and tech, these things aren't guaranteed. So, how did you make that? How did you make that call?
There are a number of things happening at the same time, Paul, for me. I suppose as somebody who taught entrepreneurship and innovation, always had a passion for that. You dabble along the way and you try a few things out that actually don't go well and they fail.
You learn the realities.
Which is part of the entrepreneurial story.
Yeah.
But, writing was always, and it still is, my passion. And I wrote some business histories in New Zealand. So the Farmers Trading Company, Briscoe's, Tatua Dairy Company, others. And at that time when schools were asking for assistance with writing, I also was undertaking a lot of commissioned history work. So as a father with a family and Deborah and I and the children. So I made that move out already with contracts in hand. And I would say that absolutely to anybody going out on their own, please don't stop your day job. Let the innovation overtake, the entrepreneurship overtake your day job. So, we already had 2 years of work banked up ahead of us before we decided to go out. And I took a team with me when I left the university. So it was only about 2 or 3 of us in the garage with the dog. But probably the founding story of Toolbox, I suppose, is also instrumental because there's lots of ways you can start an organisation. You can go out to the bank, you can go and borrow money from friends, you can try and find some VC capital funding. And a lot of that's popular in the tech world. I did a Fisher & Paykel. Now, I'm not alone in this, but I did a Fisher & Paykel. And the story, have I got time for a very short story?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to hear it.
The story goes a bit like this. So it was 1938, and two quite ambitious Kiwis, Will Fisher and Maurice Paykel, had an importing business. They'd started in 1934, and they were importing washing machines from America. The only problem was, by 1938, 4 years on, the New Zealand government hadn't managed its overseas currency very well. And we ran out of money in England. Like, there was no money left to pay overseas creditors.
Wow.
And so this is a true story. And so what they did was overnight, they said, you can't get foreign exchange. You have to apply to the government. You've got all these checks and balances to get it. And we'd run out of money. There was none to give. So Fisher & Paykel were facing something like, in the magnitude, they owed their US suppliers something like $20,000 and they were staring down the gunnels of bankruptcy. So Wolf said, don't worry, Maurice, got in his car, went round the North Island, came back with 300 orders for washing machines and said, off you go, Maurice, make them. And then that's the birth of Fisher & Paykel into manufacturing.
Wow.
So I made a promise to my wife, to Deborah, that I wouldn't do Writer's Toolbox and we wouldn't go into debt. So if it didn't prove itself, we wouldn't do it. So I had a sense of the problem. I understood the problem. I knew it was being faced by schools. I took my pen and paper drawings. Actually, it was a little PowerPoint show, to be honest. I still have it today. And I went round to a number of schools and said, I know we have a writing problem. This is how I think we can solve it. And I pre-sold Writer's Toolbox to 3 schools in New Zealand. I took that $30,000 and I found a software company who were bold enough and desperate enough for the work and commissioned the work in about November, and Toolbox was launched January, 2 months later, in New Zealand schools. And those 3 schools who signed up, those 3 individuals are still customers today.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we've been cash flow positive since day one. So I think for me, as I reflect on that, one of the reasons I did that too was I had a small part to play I was the organiser, in a great course that was run at Auckland University for inventors. And about 60 or 70 came. And one of the things that really bothered me was that the stories were so similar. This person had this, they thought was this amazing idea for a window washing or a visor or something. They had spent thousands of their life savings on this, over years tinkering in their garage. Their wife had never seen them for weeks on end. And they absolutely believed if they could only get 10 minutes in front of Stephen Tyndall, it would transform their life. And none of them had ever spoken to a customer. And I thought, you got to talk to your customer first.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it's good that you did. And so from that start, where you were able to find those initial customers to now where you've got hundreds of customers around the world in terms of schools.
Yeah.
How did that sort of journey look like? And you alluded to COVID times being being challenging as it was for many businesses. How's that journey played out?
I think, if we talk about designing a product for a second, I'd already done some sabbaticals at overseas universities. So when I decided we were going to have a writing solution, I wanted to build an international, a global product from day one. And so Toolbox was built when we did some research across a couple of years. It was aligned before any other country had got it already to the International Baccalaureate, the American Common Core, the British curriculum, the Australian curriculum, the so forth, because I knew it was a global challenge. And then I suppose if you thought about pivot points in the life of our organisation, Australia was definitely a pivot point. Our accountants told us not to go to Australia. Yeah, they did give us some good advice from time to time, but there was like, concentrate.
I won't ask you to know
No. Concentrate on the home market. Get your home market right first. But I had, in the same week in New Zealand, in the Waikato, my phone went twice, and both times was a different Australian school in Brisbane who said, "We have a writing problem. Can you please come over and talk to us? We've heard about Writer's Toolbox. We've heard it can make a difference. Can you come and talk to us?" And so we did. I tried earlier, Paul, I dabbled with agents a number of years earlier. That hadn't gone well. So, having a distributor somewhere overseas might work for some organisations. It didn't for us.
They kind of wanted to add you to their roster of things. And
you go way down the list. Yeah. You become have you tried this too? And I got another pill. So that didn't work for us. So I had already determined in my head that our strategy, if we decided to go, was we're going to be bricks and mortar. We're going to be all in from day one, or we're not doing it. So that was the decision. We went to Australia. We hired staff, a couple more than we needed, rented premises. We were going to make it work. But why I said the international bit was, I suppose, and we listened. So Toolbox wasn't built just to sort of fix a New Zealand challenge, an Aotearoa New Zealand challenge. It was built to fix a global challenge. And the Australians very kindly responded to that. They understood it. And Australia has been really good for us actually like that. Yeah.
And looking at the other markets that you've entered, has that sort of happened quite organically, or have you had to do something similar to Australia and say, look, we're going to put boots on the ground, and if we're going to make this work in this market, we've got to be all in, and then you've got to find the funds to make that happen, don't you?
Well, I think you've got to be a bit more measured. So even when you think about Australia, in some sense is actually about 7 countries. I'm not going to be careful here, I won't get into trouble, but you think, I'm going to go to Australia. Well, are you going to Australia, or are you going to try New South Wales? So you've got to be real about it. I think it's helpful. It's a bit the same as someone saying, we're going to go try the American market. Well, no, pick a state.
Yes.
See?
Yeah.
So Australia for us is a wee bit that same journey, and we're still on that journey. We're still learning and still growing. But I suppose that the growth piece for Toolbox is we've moved from having discussions with schools to discussions with clusters of schools to now working alongside dioceses, because Australia's quite different. 35% of Australian students go to a private school. Now, New Zealand's about 2 or 3%. So the market structure is very different. Parents are already acclimatised to the belief that education's important and we're going to pay for it, you see? So it's very different market structure for us. But so working from diocese to now working with regions and now countries. And so for us, it's ever learning on that trajectory, but that's really happening that's the toolbox trajectory. But probably the underlying ethos, we still want to prove its efficacy. So when I said about the UK, yes, we're growing the UK and that's really gratifying and exciting. But we're very closely watching this initial research group of 20 schools and what the teachers are saying and the impact on the children. And a couple of things, if I may. One of the things that keeps coming back is the connection with confidence and engagement and self-efficacy. So Toolbox is actually not just writing, it's about the whole person. Because you ask a child, how do they feel about writing? And the child will often say, I don't like writing. Well, that's not a cognitive response, it's an emotional response. So now if you're going to reach that young person who sometimes has even retreated, or a teenager has an emotional aversion to the even act of writing, you've got to reach them on a socio-emotional level, not just the brain level. And so when we talk about Toolbox and it's AI as one curated component inside an immersive journey that's designed to reach the whole person and take them forward. When they're not feeling they can do it, to encourage. When they're feeling they've really got this and they're better, to challenge. But to do it in a way that's uniquely meeting them. So I think the Singaporean Minister of Education, the most recent one, Minister Chan, said the challenge we have today in the opening for technology, he talks about education's trilemma. You can have, really how do you achieve quality education at an affordable cost at scale? See, it's those three things. You can have, really quality education, but it's going to come at a really high price. And if you want individualized instruction, you're going to have very low student ratios to teachers. You see, those three things are always in. And he said, courageously recently, technology, maybe we can solve this problem. We can, at scale, release customized learning that might be high quality and reach the individual. Toolbox is on that journey because the controls inside Toolbox enable the teacher to, even if the class has got 40 students in, every child can have a unique, customized experience according to their ability level, which is very hard to pull off as an individual teacher. Yeah.
And let's talk about sort of the personalised aspect that AI can help facilitate.
Yeah.
I mean, how personalised can you get? It's more than just at an ability level. It's in other areas.
Yeah. Well, there's the benefit of technology is that it can give really good data back to the teacher. So we have live data going back to that teacher all the time. So now you can make a timely educational decision about this child and interventions and how to help them. But if you think about the child, so in Toolbox, and imagine a screen. Well, imagine you're writing away, typing away on your computer at night, and then you hit a feedback button. And the moment you hit that button, AI reads that piece of writing. It's already worked out your 30 greatest strengths as a writer and your 30 weaknesses. It's already built a profile of you and your journey ahead. But it's not going to overwhelm you because that would just be cruel, like, giving you 9 things you could do. It's going to affirm you first, tell you 2 things that are really good about that piece of writing, irrespective of how good it may not be. And then it's going to say, here's 2 things to improve, your work-ons, and here's a goal. And we call goal writing strength in Toolbox, which is a percentage. You're 50%, 100%. But the 2 things to your work-ons are not random. Toolbox has already worked out through the AI that if you as a writer, given your profile and things I can see on this page, work on those 2 things first, that quality of that piece is going to go up fastest. And as you fix those, I'm going to teach you the next 2 and the next 2. I am walking alongside you. Does that make a difference? Yeah. So that's what Toolbox does.
Yeah, okay. And I like this element of the teacher's part of the picture as well, right? So it's not just this thing that you go online and do, and it's separate from the school journey.
That's important because there's lots of debate in educational circles, and you've touched on these already, Paul, about cognitive offloading, about digital amnesia. So this is students and even teachers, disassociating from actually the learning that's really meant to be happening. And the teacher is the agent of change in the classroom. You need to honour that teacher. And I think one of the things that teachers are saying about Toolbox is it's not replacing them. It's complementing their role in the classroom. They're seeing higher quality first drafts. Their marking time is halving. And now they're having learning discussions at a wholly different level with that individual student in their classroom.
Now, how do you look at the ethics of leveraging technology and AI in the classroom? I mean, there's so many possibilities of how you could delve in and have AI analyse what somebody writes, and somebody writes something that's a bit darker, somebody else writes something else, and so on. You could have AI sort of extrapolate and do all sorts of things with that information that are outside of the box, and not normally what you expect to maybe happen in a school context. There's all sorts of positives, but there's potentially a bunch of risks as well. So is this something you have to spend a lot of time thinking about?
Yeah, it's a really good question you've asked, actually, because this is education. If you're a teacher, if you're a supplier into education, you have a duty of care. Just because we're sitting over here does not abdicate us from a duty of care as a supplier, as a private company. And you also mentioned the box, so let's talk about that for a second. One of the challenges of AI, you can buy an enterprise license to ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever you want and craft your own thing and be in the market next week. But what you can't control is the box. And that was really our dilemma in and it's expensive, gotta say. And, around 2016, around 2017, when we were going deeper into this work, was there were shortcuts. But if you don't know fundamentally what's inside that black box and have actually crafted how and why it does particular things, you cannot control the outputs with sufficient responsibility. And so that's why we went on the journey we did, because you cannot buy a data set of student writing globally. They do not exist. We've curated our own. It's now 4.9 billion words. It's bigger than Wikipedia. But we know how the student writes because they don't write how adults write. And when it comes to the feedback, it's really good you raised this. I'll give you one example. I got shown a piece of feedback by a teacher the other week. It was in Australia. It was a different company. They were giving it was a mathematics company. And they were teaching this young child who was, 10 years old, multiplication. And the child was obviously getting frustrated with the multiplication and the AIs trying to teach him multiplication because he clearly didn't like maths. And after listening for a few times to the AI suggestions, he swore at the AI. He typed a swear word at the AI. Well, at this juncture, the AI said to him that he had breached the user policies of the site and it was removing him from the ability to use the AI. And the poor child, we'll call him Johnny, was so upset at this. I saw the conversation string. For the next 10 minutes, he was apologising to the AI, whose name was George, and pleading with George, please don't take him off the system. And he was so sorry, and he would never do it again.
Oh, wow.
Now, the child has now descended into a social, emotional state. You see, we have a responsibility. So we have gone to great lengths crafting the sorts of responses the student will get, because writing is an emotionally charged and thinking act. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah. I guess the ethics side, when it comes to AI, there are lots of directions that you could go on that. Now, another piece for you, I imagine, is the security and privacy around, what somebody puts into their writing, right? Like, when I think back to primary school for me, before I had access to any sort of a screen, everything would be pen and paper and it would never get very far, right? But imagine from time to time, there will be things that end up written down that, you want to maybe make sure that those things don't go too far, whether it's just somebody being embarrassed by their work versus somebody else's. And, I guess, this is probably an ongoing part of the dilemma in a world where we have regular cybersecurity incidents and data privacy types of incidents, and where you don't want people sort of snooping in on what's not designed for their eyes.
I think there's probably two elements to that for us as a company, and you go on these journeys, and the initial stage is really exciting because it's a creative stage, and you're building this thing, and you're going to take on the world. You actually know the first journey is, can we make this work? So it's quite organic, and it's really exciting. But then it does take hold, and then you've got to work out, okay, so how can I build systems around this and manage it well and all the rest of it? And then eventually you get to another stage where you're facing enterprise-type decisions. And there's all these new security protocols you have to adhere to. And this is a rapidly moving, as some of your talks have engaged with. This is changing, right? The rules that existed 2 years ago, there's a whole new set of rules and policies and more stringency today. So you have to have teams of people looking at this, which we do, and you've got to be really responsive because the different educational jurisdictions are changing the rules all the time. New South Wales, even in the past 3 weeks, brought out a whole new set of. So I suppose in part, the vigilance never ceases, and you have to. That was one for me because I didn't realise the scale of the investment we would need. 5 years ago, I never could have envisaged the scale of the investment we would need in this area of our business. And you have to, you need to. I suppose the other piece stems from the relationship, because you've mentioned, somebody writing something which, for all sorts of reasons, could be detrimental or of a concern. Let's just say of a concern. One of the things we do, Paul, is we've got some really great diagnostic testing software that, again, we've had in the market for 10 years, that a child of any age can test their writing skills and then give the school back a report, but also say, here's what you need to do next to grow this child's skills. But we have really good relationships. So if a student, with the schools we serve, so if a student writes something that actually flags, because we don't take people out of it, there's still humans involved. I think it's important, right? Yeah. So if somebody writes something that is of a concern, Toolbox will be on the phone to you. And then, the teacher in the school who are really well placed in that relationship to make those calls can. So we're trying to do two things: to play our part well, but also still honour and uphold the school to do their part well. Yeah. Yeah,
that's good. Yeah, I mean it's an evolving area, and I can imagine that we will see more and more change in that area as we start to lean in more on technology, as society gets a deeper understanding of where AI should be, where it shouldn't be, and as we get more and more digital in terms of our schools. Now, looking at your overall journey, from what I can gather, you've invested. I think you were telling me before the show, sort of, I think in the tens of millions.
Yeah, it was 20 million. I said,
right? Paul. yeah. In terms of into developing, your AI, which, as you say, sort of tacks in a different direction to probably what most people are used to in terms of the Gen AI direction. How do you see that looking in the years ahead, and what's the potential from a scaling perspective? Is it that you double down on what you're doing and get this thing signed up at a national level or a state type of level? Do you pivot into maths and other sorts of things because you've worked out a way that actually possibly could apply in other areas? How do you make these decisions? Because I'm sure a lot more than what I'm suggesting crosses your mind, and you have to think about it.
I think that's a really good question. Let me take a couple of those things. I think one of the areas is if you decide that innovation is going to be your strategy as a company or as an individual, what does that really mean? And for me at Toolbox, as a student of innovation, I suppose, I wanted from the get-go to build an innovation culture. Well, what does that actually mean? Think about that. That means that you're going to shorten the decision lines and you're going to bring people together who've never worked before. So at Toolbox, we have illustrators, designers, artists sitting next door to programmers, to content writers, to educationalists. We don't use agencies for those things. We have people in-house. Now, that's not common, but it's part of what you sign up for when you say, no, we want to actually build this innovation hub. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
And I suppose then the other aspect is you've sort of signaled at, what next? Well, if you're genuinely going to be an innovation company, one of the measures is that, well, this is true of Toolbox, 80% of our income today comes from products and services that did not exist 5 years ago. 80% of our income. Wow. And we have quite a long innovation roadmap in place. We're several years into generation 3 of the AI. It hasn't been released yet. So, you have to have a vision and chart for the future as well. And the schools have been part of that journey for us. They've been fantastic. We've had terrific feedback from educators and school leaders and teachers along this journey. We've learnt from them. They've learnt from us. And then also there's the part, I suppose, the responsibility of the innovator. Sometimes you also have to envision the future, correct? You actually have to articulate in a way that your customers can't yet articulate or see what you have the privilege to try and do. And at Toolbox today, that's not an individual's thing, that's a team thing. And I'm very privileged to walk alongside and to work with some really talented people who are a lot smarter than I am in many areas. So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I think there'll be some people will be listening in and thinking, well, I'm not sure if my school has access to Writer's Toolbox. Or, this is sort of some of the thinking that went through my mind looking at schools was, what technology do these different schools, use, and what do I think would be most appropriate for my own child? So, are there ways that people can sort of look up and find out the schools that actually have your technology? Are there ways? There are ways that parents can maybe nudge and encourage their schools to take a look. What do you recommend for people that have listened in and they thought this would be great for my daughter, my son, etc.?
Oh, that's nice. So writerstoolbox.com is obviously, the web address. So go on there. There's some great case studies on there from New Zealand schools, Australian schools, British, all over the world. And I think if there's an inquiry form there, if you want to get in touch, if you're a parent, if you want a board of trustees, please talk to your school, because I think it's a global issue. It's one that that impacts New Zealand greatly. The past decade of writing results in New Zealand haven't been great. The recent use of the common assessment activity in writing, 50% of the children in the trials were failing. But I think the lovely encouraging message is we can actually do something about this. In our lifetime, we could solve this for our country, for our nation, and the outcome would be extraordinary.
Yeah, I think, you get things right from an educational perspective, and that flows on to addressing challenges of poverty and all sorts of other things across the country, right?
Yeah, so, 100%.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Ian.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you coming in. I can imagine there'll be some other topics we could delve into another time. But we'll leave it there for today. So, yeah, thanks very much for joining us on the New Zealand Tech Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Paul.
And, of course, a big thank you to our show partners as well. 2 Degrees, Spark, Workday, HP, 1NZ, and Gorilla Technology. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. We'll catch you on the next episode. See ya.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.